With our Bibles opened to Mark chapter 2, please follow along as we read, starting in verse 18. A bit of backdrop, if you remember, the last couple weeks Jesus has been with the Pharisees, and their self-righteousness has held them back from experiencing and enjoying Christ. And the text continues today in verse 18. Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. And people came and said to him, "Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said to them, "Can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in that day. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. If he does, the patch tears away from it. The new from the old, and the worse tear is made. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is destroyed, and so are the skins. But new wine is for fresh wineskins." May the Lord bless the reading of his word. You can be good without God. So read the advertisement in all caps on the school buses at my secular university, which used to transport the students to and from campus. The idea, you can be good without God, stems from the German atheistic philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who coined the phrase, "God is dead." Of course, as an atheist, he didn't actually believe that God had died, nor that we had killed him, as he said. Rather, his point was to say, we must be strong. We atheists know that this religion stuff is not true. We need some sort of an ethic. We need some sort of a morality apart from this concept of God and religion. We must be self-reliant. Only the self-reliant will overcome and succeed. Look within. Well, you don't need to be an atheist to be self-reliant, self-assured, and self-satisfied. In fact, religious people can be some of the most self-satisfied people under the sun. But what they can never be, not from the heart, is truly joyful. They cannot be joyful from the heart because they're missing something. Indeed, one could argue they're missing everything because they're missing something that only God can give, something from without, something from outside of themselves, himself. In our text today, we find a simple two-part conversation. Firstly, Jesus is asked a question, and then secondly, we receive his answer. And what we learn is that true and abiding satisfaction only comes from recognizing and celebrating the person and work of Jesus Christ. We have to see Christ, but it's not enough to just see him. We must actively celebrate his identity, his person, and his work. In verse 18 we read, John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and people came and said to him, "Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" We've now been with these Pharisees in our study for a few weeks, and there's this growing tension, an escalating conflict between they and Jesus. But today we find even John the Baptist's disciples, they too are involved. Now this scene may have been potentially awkward because we know from John chapter 1 verse 40 that Andrew, the first disciple that Jesus called in Mark chapter 1, along with his brother Simon, Andrew had previously been John's disciple. And here in our text, we learn that between Andrew's two leaders, Jesus and John, John the Baptist was the stricter of the two. He was the stricter teacher, the stricter leader. And the point of conflict on this occasion, it was fasting. Why don't your disciples fast? The Pharisees fast. John the Baptist's disciples fast. Andrew, brother, you used to fast when you were with us with John's disciples. Jesus, why don't your disciples fast? We need to pause. Let's ask a question. Where in God's law, in the Old Testament, is fasting commanded? In the Old Testament, there's a number of times we find individuals practicing self-imposed fasting. We have a biblical category of fasting. David fasts when God strikes his son with Bathsheba sick. Various prophets fasted at various times and called for fasts in times of great difficulty. But those stories are descriptive. They're describing. They're descriptive and not prescriptive. There's only one day out of the calendar year that the Jewish people were commanded by God to fast. That was the Day of Atonement. That's it. One day, only one day, the entire year. But the traditional or the oral law, which we learned about last week, prescribes personal fasting for a number of different reasons. If you'll remember, the oral law, what was that? That was something that was meant to be a fence around God's law so that the people don't even get close to becoming unclean or stained by sin. In other words, the oral law was a set of man-made standards added to God's standard. And by Jesus' day, it had become standard practice for the Pharisees to fast 2 days a week on Monday and Thursday. That's why we find in Luke chapter 18, verses 11 through 12, we see a Pharisee who's standing by himself. He's separate from everybody else, and he's saying, God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, and even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. Let's put this in perspective. God's standard required 1 day of fasting per year. But Pharisaical tradition required 2 days of fasting each week. That's 104 days of fasting in the year. That means that the religious leaders had increased God's law by 10,400%. That's what legalism always does. It creates this man-made standard. And while the standard may appear to be more difficult, the thing about legalism's standards are that they are attainable. You can do it. It might be harder, but you can do it. But you know what legalism never does? You know what it can't help you do? It can't help you to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all of your strength. You can starve yourself to death, but you can't love God apart from His grace. And these Pharisees right here in our text today, they are the proof. They're standing right in front of God. They're fasting right in front of God. They're fasting unto God, or so they said. But God is in front of them, and they're pointing at their own standard instead of to God. They're in front of God, pointing to their fasting instead of pointing to the God who's right in front of them. In our text, the people have noted that Jesus' disciples don't fast like the Pharisees. This is a showdown. We have a showdown between legalism and God. The people are asking. No, they're confronting Jesus. Hey, what's going on here? Why aren't your disciples pious? Why aren't your disciples spiritual? Who do you think that you are, Jesus? If you want to be taken seriously in our context as a spiritual leader, you're going to have to learn to play by our rules. Why don't your disciples fast? Now, I want to pause here and I want to welcome you. I want to welcome you into the methodology of my sermon preparation. Whenever I study a text or write a sermon, I'm asking myself, what is the fallen, redemptive focus? That means, what is the problem in the text which is stemming from life in a fallen world? Because here's an underlying principle in my process of interpreting the Bible. God is in the process, and he will win. God is in the process of making all things new. It's a process and not an event. And he uses his word to make this process come about. God wants to redeem every single fallen area in your life and in my life. Well, what is the fallen, redemptive focus in our text? In other words, what is the problem of these Pharisees? Well, the problem in the text, it's not fasting. It's not fasting, I can tell you that. The text is not here to teach us how we ought to think about fasting. No, this text is here to expose something that is deep inside of each one of us. The problem is not fasting. The problem is self-satisfaction. The problem is self-righteousness. The problem of these Pharisees was self-assured. They were self-reliant. In a word, they were acting like everything was for God and that they were so spiritual. But the reality was that they were practical atheists. Practical atheists. A practical atheist is one who claims religion but lives as though God does not exist. Functionally, a functional atheist has all of the trappings of religion but lacks relationship with God. In our text, God was right in front of them, and they were living like they didn't need him. Practical atheists. The atheists at my university said, you don't need God to be good, but I tell you, you don't need to be an atheist to be self-reliant and self-satisfied. Jesus, the God-man, God himself is standing right in front of these people, and they didn't need him because they were satisfied in themselves. They could do it without him. What's the disease? What's the diagnosis? The diagnosis is self-satisfaction. The fundamental disease of the Pharisees. Living like you've got what you need to get through life. Though you'd never say it, you've got everything you need to make it in this world. It all depends upon you, and you're going to make it work. They thought that they could fulfill and keep God's law. And they were satisfied that they were doing so. They even assured themselves that their standard was right and correct, and so they surrounded themselves with others who were also self-assured. They created an entire tribe of self-satisfied individuals, just a bunch of people telling one another, hey, you're healthy, and here's how I know it. You're keeping the same standard that I'm keeping, and I'm healthy. We're healthy. Can you see yourself in the text? This disease is not unique to these Pharisees. Because by nature, each one of us is a self-satisfied Pharisee. What a terrible thing to go through life with a bunch of people who look and sound just like you, constantly reassuring you that all is well, but never stopping to ask God what he thinks. The culture tells you you're fine. The religious people tell you you're fine. Your pastor tells you you're fine. The priest tells you you're fine. But you never stop to ask God, am I really fine? Each one of us are Pharisees by nature, self-satisfied, and unless God himself comes and shakes us, we will go right to our graves that way. But you say, Pastor, I'm actually not self-satisfied. I'm actually discouraged. I'm deeply depressed. In fact, I feel totally unsatisfied. I feel helpless. And I say, I hear you, my friend. I hear you. But listen, self-satisfaction is only one side of a double-edged sword called pride, a sword that cuts in two directions. You see, those who are self-satisfied and self-assured feel that they've met the standards in their own mind and in their own heart. Standards they think make them feel a degree of confidence before God and others. But what happens when self-satisfied individuals do not live up to the standard? Whether it be one they've created in their own mind, one that belongs to their culture, or whether it be God's very own law, what happens then? Well, they're often the ones who become despondent. They feel trapped, stuck. You ever feel trapped by sin? Stuck in the ditch of your own making, a ditch that you yourself dug with the shovel of your sin? You sit through sermon after sermon and feel that nothing in the Bible seems to actually be of help to you? You feel you've tried everything. You say, if only I could get back to the way things were when I first became a Christian, that joy I used to feel a long time ago when I became a Christian. If only I could get back to that. Friend, that is the opposite side of this blade. You are correct. That is not self-satisfaction. That is dissatisfaction due to yourself. The generic name of this disease is pride. What are the symptoms of this disease? How might I know if I have this disease? How might you know if you have this disease? Firstly, we can say that it is marked by the symptom of a lack of joy. A lack of joy. You see, we Christians, we should be the most joyful people in all of the world because of who Christ is and what He's done. We are reconciled to God, and nothing can separate us from Him. Self-satisfied people, while they may feel a degree, a sense of happiness at times, they don't know how to rejoice in suffering. They don't know the confidence of faith in what feels like a losing battle. If they're happy, it's because the circumstances in their lives are happy. But they lack that deep and abiding joy. Secondly, they're marked by the symptom of judgmentalism. They're judgmental. Self-satisfied people cannot help but be dissatisfied with everyone else who does not live up to their standard. They look down their noses at the lost and at those who are less spiritual. Instead of feeling sympathy for the lost, they assume an inherent superiority. They're marked by a critical spirit, often accompanied by ungratefulness. Because they're so satisfied with themselves, they are critical of those who do not think and act like themselves. They have a strong tribal mentality. And those who are not in their tribe, well, there's something less. As a result, self-satisfied individuals rarely encourage, and they're ungrateful, unthankful, assuming that the blessings in their lives are what they earned and deserve somehow, an inherent right due to their superior knowledge, superior theology, or superior spirituality. Their lives are not marked by thankfulness, not believing from the heart that every good gift comes down from the Father of light. Rather, the good things in their lives come from their actions, their spirituality, their prayers, their good theology, their devotion. When others see these self-satisfied people, especially the youth and the lost, they're not drawn to Jesus. They're not adoring Jesus. It's a wretched disease, self-satisfaction. But what's its cause? We've diagnosed it. We've considered its symptoms. How do you get this disease? What's its cause? It's caused by spiritual blindness. Self-satisfaction is caused by spiritual blindness. It's a monster of a thing to be spiritually blind, because when one is spiritually blind, it's kind of like having a spiritual mirror constantly and directly right in front of you, inhibiting stopping you from being able to see God who's behind that mirror. Friend, did you know that you could go your entire life being spiritually blind and you would never even know it? You could be blind to your own blindness. You could join the membership of this church. You could be a good pente. You could go straight through life spiritually blind and you would never even know it. That was the problem with these Pharisees. Can you see that in the text? Can you see their spiritual blindness? They're around Jesus. They could hear Jesus. They could see Jesus, but they couldn't see Jesus. All they could do is ask this stupid, self-betraying question, why don't your disciples fast? Jesus answers their question with a question. Follow along in verses 19 through 20. And Jesus said to them, can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as the bridegroom is with them, they cannot fast. The days will come, though, when the bridegroom will be taken away, and then they will fast in that day. Jesus compares himself to a groom and his disciples to the groomsmen. Now, we got to know something about weddings in Jesus' day. Weddings in Jesus' day obviously took place without cars and cameras. That means that when you went to a Jewish wedding in Jesus' day, you didn't sit in Addis Ababa traffic all day only to arrive at Gion and have pictures taken the entire second half of the day while you melted in the sun. Now, these were old-fashioned weddings, and everybody was partying. The place was popping. Nightclubs of Addis Ababa ain't got anything on these old-fashioned weddings. They partied at weddings, and even the Pharisees would break their fasts in celebration and dancing. The Pharisees danced. It would be unheard of to fast at a wedding party, which, by the way, lasted about a week, many days. Jesus is saying, I'm the groom, and my boys are partying with me. Why? Because it's all about me. They are celebrating me. Fasting, in comparison, incorporates an element of mourning, the opposite of celebration. In fact, there's a correlation that can be drawn between fasting and sorrow. Fasting is done in contrition. In times of great need, it's done in repentance and in a seeking after God. Fasting is supposed to be done unto God because we recognize that we are anything but satisfying to Him. What about this imagery of the bridegroom? Interestingly enough, in the Old Testament, the coming Messiah is never compared to a bridegroom. The long-awaited Savior is not compared to a bridegroom. Only God Himself, Yahweh, is compared to a bridegroom, and His people, the bride. In Mark's gospel, Mark doesn't so much draw attention to Jesus as the Messiah. He draws attention to Jesus, the Messiah, as the Son of God. Remember, that's how this book begins in chapter 1, verse 1. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. When Jesus says, I'm the groom, He's drawing attention to His divinity, to His godness. Jesus is saying, I am the God-man. I am creator of heaven and earth. I am provider of my people's needs. I am what they need. I have come to claim my bride, and I've come with the power of God because I am God in the flesh. And I've come for my bride. Why would they fast? Why would they ever fast? The time of mourning is completed. Fasting is all about me, and I'm here now. I'm the groom, and it's all about me. And with these words, Jesus places His own person, His identity, at the center of the stage. He is what the play is all about. The theater exists for Him. He then follows this celebratory image with these two parables in verses 21 through 22. Would you follow along with me? No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. If he does, the patch tears away from it, and the new from the old, and a worse tear is made. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is destroyed, and so are the skins. But new wine is for fresh wineskins. A brief breakdown of these parables. An old piece of cloth that has been washed many times, well, it shrinks over time, doesn't it? When it gets a tear in it, if you make a patch out of a new piece of unshrunk cloth, and if you sew that into or onto the old piece, it will then shrink when you wash the garment again. And as it shrinks, it will tear the clothing even more. Likewise with wine. In the ancient Near East, wine was fermented in the leather skins of goats and sheep. They would take the leather skins and they would sew them together, creating something like a leather pouch. And then they would pour in the new wine for it to ferment. Fermentation is the process wherein yeast turns the natural sugars of the grape juice into alcohol. During this process, gases are released. Well, if this process was done inside old used skins, the gases from the fermentation process, they would put too much pressure on the old stitching of that old bag and therefore burst that bag, thus wasting both the wine and the skins. But if the new wine was poured into newly stitched fresh skin, then the bag could handle the pressure. What is the purpose of the wedding feast and the two parables? Why are they here? What is Jesus endeavoring to teach us? They teach us that Jesus is not coming to continue the old covenant. He's not coming to be an addition to Judaism. He's something completely new. A new way. A new path. He's not an addition to the old way. He's the fulfillment of the old way by establishing, by being the new way. He's not here to move the promise along. He is the promise. He's not moving the narrative along. He is the narrative. Adam was the representative of the human race, but he fell. Christ is the second Adam, a new and better Adam, a better representative. Israel had covenant with God. They broke covenant. Christ is the new and better Israel, and through him all of the nations are blessed. He's a better representative, a better prophet, a better priest, a better king. And you can't put him in an old box. You can't put him in the old box of all the Old Testament types, because all of those Old Testament types in the Old Testament box are pointing forward to show him as the main star of the show. Jesus is on center stage. Here's the effect that these three stories are supposed to have upon each one of us in this room. We're supposed to hear these stories and recognize that Christ can't just be added to our lives. You don't take up Christ like you take up a hobby. Whereas you look for a job, I'm looking for a new job. I found Jesus. The point is, everything is about Jesus. The question on the table is not, will you add Jesus to your life? No, the intended redemptive effect of these stories is that you would see everything is all about Jesus. And that's how you should interpret your Bible. That's how you should live. That's how you should think. You should take everything captive to this. But maybe you're still not getting me. It's all about Jesus may just sound like a superlative or a true truth to you. Let me put it in another way. The intended purpose of these stories from the lips of Jesus, the intended effect these stories are supposed to have in your life and my life, is for you to become more aware of Jesus than anything in your life. The purpose is to obliterate anything in your heart that would endeavor to compete with Jesus, because you're more aware of Jesus than anything else. More aware of His grace than of your sin. More aware of His love than you are of your sorrow. More aware of His mercies, which are new every morning. Did you wake up this morning and grab hold of those mercies? Are you even aware of them? More aware of forgiveness and reconciliation to God than the sin you're currently stuck in. More aware of His heart than you are of your own self-inflicted chastisement. More aware of Jesus than you are of your needs and wants. You can't put a patch on legalism. You can't put a patch on religiosity. Don't even try. Throw it away. Jesus is something completely other. He's a new garment, and He wants you to put it on. Your world, with all its self-satisfaction and self-righteousness, it cannot contain the new and satisfying wine, which is Jesus. Let's return for a moment to that double-edged sword of pride for a moment. On the one end, you have self-satisfaction, and on the other end, you have the feeling of being trapped in your own sin. For those of you who recognize the disease of self-satisfaction in your lives, the proper response is to come to Jesus with this joy, recognizing that you could never satisfy God's righteous requirements. There's a form of Christianity that uses the name Jesus. It has words like gospel or wangel. It has the name of Jesus in its mouth, but it's actually stepping over Jesus. It steps over Jesus. It steps over the cross, and it endeavors to present to God something that you yourself have done, something you yourself have accomplished, some feeling that you feel, some sense of spirituality. You want to give it to God and say, I've done it, haven't I? Steps over Jesus. Dispensational theologian J.D. Pentecost, writing on what life will be like in the millennium. That means when Jesus returns, what will life with Jesus be like after He returns? He says, in the millennial system, we find the worship centers in an altar on which blood is sprinkled, and on which offered burnt offerings and on which are offered burnt offerings and sin offerings. There is the reinstitution of the Levitical order, that's the priesthood, the Levitical order, and that the sons of Zadok are set aside for a priestly ministry. In other words, what's this theologian saying? He's saying that when Jesus returns, ancient Old Testament Judaism, temple worship, sacrifice of animals will be reinstated. And there will be sin offerings at the temple to Jesus. Friends, this is garbage. For those in Jesus, there is no more sin offering to make. You become a debtor to mercy alone. The only sacrifice left for those who believe in a sacrifice of thanksgiving is a sacrifice of thanksgiving because Jesus paid it all. You cannot win acceptance or reconciliation to God apart from Jesus' person and work. And that is why Christ would be taken away. Would you look with me one last time at verse 20? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, taken away from these groomsmen. Here Jesus is alluding to or drawing attention to the fact that He would be taken away from His disciples in judgment. The day was coming when the light of day would give way to darkest night, and Christ would be taken away from His disciples as a prisoner in chains. He would be mocked by self-satisfied leaders. He would be whipped by these self-satisfied leaders. A crown of thorns would be dug into His brow, and He would be dragged before a Gentile ruler The Jews dragged their God before a Gentile ruler, and with one voice, these self-satisfied men would cry out, "Crucify him!" A cross of wood would be placed on his shoulders, and he would carry that wood through the streets of Jerusalem until he was outside of the city. And there on this hill called Golgotha, that cross would be laid down onto the earth, only to have his bleeding body stretched out upon it, his hands, his feet stretched out and nailed into it. And then that cross would be lifted up. And as Christ looked out on this spiritually blind crowd of self-satisfied men and women, he would cry out to his Father in heaven, "Oh, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they do." Forgive them. These spiritually blind, self-satisfied people. He died for the spiritually blind. He died for the self-satisfied while they were still sinners, because they could never satisfy a holy and righteous God. It wasn't really the self-satisfied who crushed Jesus at the cross, though, was it? Isaiah teaches us that it was God who crushed his Son to satisfy his own righteous and just and good wrath toward self-satisfied sinners who are blind to their sin. And there's a promise of reconciliation to this God. And it's available to everyone who believes. Have your eyes been opened? Well, come and join the celebration. Come and join the party. Free grace. Come to Jesus. Step over him no longer. No longer endeavor to atone with self-satisfying legalism. Come and celebrate the one who truly satisfies. And there's the other side of the sword. The second group, those of you who feel trapped by sin. Friend, do you know what would happen if you were able to break away from your sinful patterns of sexual lust, pornography, cheating on taxes, lying? If you were able to break away from that on your own? Do you know what would happen if you were finally free by your own strength? You'd become a self-satisfied monster of pride. You're actually stuck in pride in the same way as these Pharisees. You're just on the opposite end of the spectrum. And the only way you're going to break free is if you become as these groomsmen became. They were celebrating Jesus. They were more aware of Jesus than anything else in their lives. You must become more aware of Jesus than you are of your own sin and your own habits of sin. Taking this wedding imagery and applying it to our own lives, it's meant to be a model for us of how to break away from a life that's trapped by sin. Think about how a Jewish wedding lasted an entire week and recognize something here. That change, the change that you desire, it's a process. It's a process and not an event. Sanctification is a process and not an event. Secondly, think on these groomsmen and their identity. Because of what Jesus did on the cross, he has died for your sins, even habitual sin, committed after conversion. You have a new identity that is not traced back to that habitual sin. You have an identity that has zero connection with what you've done in this life with regards to sin. God welcomes you as his own son or daughter. You've been justified and declared right in the eyes of God, and now you're accepted as one who is completely pure. You say, yes, I know that. You preach that every week, but I still can't break from my sinful patterns. And I respond to you. Listen, you're accepted, but God's work in you is not completed. He isn't finished with you yet. There's work that God still wants to accomplish inside of you. Paul Tripp puts it this way: the power of sin has been broken, but the presence of sin still remains and will be progressively eradicated. In the same way that these groomsmen knew that the wedding was a week-long process and not a quick event, you must have this mental category in your mind that growth in holiness is a process. It is progressive. It is not a one-time event. There will be setbacks, but when Jesus saved you, when He bought you, He committed to walking with you over the course of the rest of your life, no matter what sins you have committed or that you struggle with today, to change you over the course of your life. And the way He does that is through His person, you becoming more aware of Him and His grace than you are of your sin. The only way to break out of habitual patterns of sin that make you feel stuck is for you to become more aware of grace than you are of your own sin. True joy only comes as you become more aware of Him than you are of your own sin. Finally, for those of you who are visiting this morning, for those of you who are not Christian, not that those are the same thing, but if you're visiting and you're not a Christian, or if you're just not a Christian, Jesus has made it clear that Christianity is not about a list of things that you do. Have you been thinking about Christianity like that? A list of things you have to do? Rather, it's coming to Him. But you cannot have Jesus and the world. You cannot have Jesus and your religiosity. You know, I was evangelizing to somebody this week, a non-believer. He was not a believer. And as I was sharing with him the gospel, I could tell that he was touched. And we got to the end of the story, or the evangelism time. And I said, I think Jesus wants you to come to Him today. And suddenly I saw his face go hard. He had been soft, he could feel it, and suddenly he goes hard, and he says, I'm not becoming a Pente. And I said, I didn't say anything about Pentes. I didn't say anything about Orthodox. I'm talking about a person, not a system. Will you come to a person? Friend, if you have not trusted in Jesus, you are rapidly coming to the Adubabai of your soul. You're coming to the Adubabai, and you have to make a decision. You can't take multiple ways at the same time. You either are going to follow Jesus or you're going to follow a system. You're either going to follow Jesus or you're going to follow a religion. You're either going to trust Jesus or you're going to hold on to the things that you love. You're either going to take that one road, and there's only one road. You're either going to take that boyfriend. You're holding on to his hand. He's an unbeliever. You come to the Adubabai, and Jesus is going this way, and your non-believing boyfriend is going that way. He's pulling you. He's saying, come with me, and Jesus is saying, no, come with me. Which way are you going? It's only Jesus. You can't have anybody besides Jesus. It's Christ and Christ alone. But Christ says, I came to give you life and to give it abundantly. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. Would you come to Jesus today?